For 20 years, Michael Brennan had been driving the same route, the same rails, the same faces, the same emptiness. He was a man who existed between destinations, never truly arriving anywhere that mattered. But on an autumn afternoon in 1893, when two strangers boarded his train, everything changed. What began as an ordinary journey became a roller coaster of moral choices, shocking revelations, and unexpected truths. Michael would discover that sometimes the most ordinary people in the most ordinary moments can face extraordinary decisions that reshape their entire understanding of who they are and what their life truly means.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The morning light filtered through the depot's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the platform. Michael Brennan stood beside the locomotive, his fingers tracing the worn metal of the engine as he had done countless times before. The year was 1893, and the Boston to New York route had become his entire world, a predictable circle of steel and steam that never seemed to lead anywhere but back to where he started. At 40 years old, Michael looked like a man who had spent 2 decades in purgatory. His face was weathered, his eyes held a distant quality that suggested he was always looking through things rather than at them. His uniform was immaculate, pressed with the precision of ritual rather than pride. He knew every screw, every bolt, every inch of this train like he knew the lines on the palms of his own hands. But this knowledge brought no satisfaction, only a deeper understanding of his own irrelevance. The locomotive was more alive than he was. The machine had purpose, to move people from one place to another. Michael had only the repetition of that motion. The station master, a portly man named Harrison, with a graying mustache and perpetually red cheeks, approached with the passenger manifest. Michael took it without looking directly at the older man, a habit he had perfected over the years, existing in proximity to people without truly being present with them. 3 passengers today. A young man with a worn satchel, an elderly woman with a traveling coat, and a businessman headed to New York on some corporate errand. Ordinary, forgettable, just like every other day. Michael had not always been this way. There was a time in his youth when he had dreams. He had wanted to be a railroad engineer, to design the great locomotives of the future, to contribute something meaningful to the progress of this nation that seemed so full of possibility in those days. He had read every book he could find on mechanical engineering. He had spent his evenings sketching designs, imagining locomotives that were faster, more efficient, more beautiful than anything currently in operation. His mother had encouraged these dreams, even as she worked double shifts as a seamstress to keep them afloat after Michael's father had abandoned them both. But life had a way of pushing such aspirations aside. A job was offered, just temporary, they said. Money was needed to support his aging mother, and the opportunity to pursue education seemed to always be 1 year away, just 1 more year of saving. The job that was supposed to be temporary had become a prison, though one with no bars and no jailer but himself. 1 year became 2 years, 2 years became a decade, and a decade became 20. The promotion that would have allowed him to transition into design work never materialized. The supervisors changed, but the indifference remained constant. Michael was reliable, punctual, and competent, which meant he was valuable precisely in his current role, and therefore could never be spared to pursue anything else. Michael did not drink heavily, did not gamble, did not engage in the vices that consumed many of his colleagues. Instead, he had perfected something more insidious, the art of quiet resignation. He lived in a small apartment above a bookstore, a place so devoid of personal touch that it might as well have been a hotel room. No photographs adorned his walls, no books lined his shelves. Despite his love of reading, books seemed to suggest permanence, investment in the future, and Michael had stopped making such investments years ago. His meals were eaten in silence at the station or in cheap diners where no one knew his name and no one cared to learn it. He had acquaintances but no friends. colleagues but no companions. He existed in a state of profound solitude, not isolated by circumstance, but by choice. The choice to keep emotional distance from all things that might create complication or risk. His mother had passed away 5 years ago. Michael had inherited a modest sum, money she had somehow managed to save despite decades of poverty. But he had done nothing with it. It sat in a bank account, gathering dust and modest interest, a monument to his own lack of purpose. People might look at his discipline, his reliability, his perfect attendance record, and think he was a man of virtue. But Michael knew the truth. He was simply afraid. Afraid to want anything, afraid to reach for anything, because wanting something meant risking disappointment. And disappointment was a pain he could not afford to experience. This fear had become so deeply embedded in his being that it functioned almost as a principle of life. When opportunity presented itself, he turned away. When connection seemed possible, he withdrew. When change knocked at his door, he pretended not to be home. The world in Michael's carefully constructed philosophy was fundamentally chaotic and cruel. The only safety lay in minimizing one's engagement with that chaos, in maintaining psychological distance from the complications that came with caring about things or people. The first passenger boarded at 8 o'clock sharp. The young man was perhaps 18 or 19 years old, though something in his eyes suggested he had lived through more than his years should have allowed. His clothes were clean but threadbare, patched in places with the care of someone who could not afford new garments. His shoes were worn through at the heel. His hair was neatly combed, but had the quality of someone who washed it in cold water because he had no access to hot water. He carried a bundle of newspapers under one arm and a small leather satchel that looked like it contained everything he owned in the world. Michael watched from his position in the locomotive without really watching. The boy moved to a middle seat, arranging the newspapers carefully beside him with the delicate precision of someone handling something of great value. There was something almost protective about the way he held them, as though they were precious cargo, rather than yesterday's news meant to be sold to bored travelers for a penny or two. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he settled into his seat, and there was a quality to his entire demeanor that suggested he was fleeing from something, rather than traveling toward something. His eyes darted toward the window as if expecting pursuit, and he chose a seat where he could see the platform while remaining partially obscured from view. The second passenger arrived moments later, requiring assistance from the station master. Eleanor Hawthorne was a woman who had clearly lived her full measure of years, though not without grace. She moved with the careful deliberation of age, using a carved wooden cane that seemed to support her not just physically, but spiritually as well. Her traveling coat was expensive, well-maintained, and probably purchased in better days when her circumstances were different. She wore a small hat adorned with a faded purple ribbon, and she carried a cloth bag from which protruded the edges of wrapped packages, gifts, perhaps, or items for someone else's needs. Eleanor took a seat across the aisle from the young man, and something in the way she looked at him, with the gentle recognition of someone who sees the pain in others because they have seen much of it in their own life, suggested a kindness that had not dimmed with age. She arranged her bag carefully beside her and gazed out the window with the peaceful expression of someone who had learned to find satisfaction in simple observations. The morning light caught her face, revealing the intricate network of wrinkles that mapped a lifetime of experience. Michael received the signal from Harrison that all passengers were aboard. He engaged the locomotive with mechanical precision, executing movements that his hands could perform without requiring his mind to engage. As the train pulled away from the station, the familiar rhythm began. The hiss of steam, the clacking of wheels on rails, the gentle rocking that had become so ingrained in his existence that he barely noticed it anymore. The world moved past in its predictable way, and Michael moved with it, a component in a larger machine, interchangeable, and ultimately insignificant.
The landscape rolled past, fields of autumn wheat beginning to turn gold, scattered farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys, small towns that appeared and disappeared like forgotten dreams. Michael navigated the route with his eyes nearly closed, metaphorically speaking. He had driven this line so many times that he could do it in absolute darkness if necessary. There were no surprises on this line, no unexpected curves or hidden dangers. Everything was mapped, predictable, safe in its absolute monotony. This was exactly what Michael had come to crave. A world without surprises, without unpredictability, without the possibility of being caught off guard. An hour into the journey, as the train moved through the countryside, Michael became aware of a sound, not the usual sounds of the locomotive and rails, but something else. A voice, soft but animated, coming from the passenger car behind him. Eleanor was speaking to the young man. Michael could not hear the words clearly through the mechanical noise and distance, but the tone was evident. She was engaging him in conversation, drawing him out with genuine interest, showing the kind of attention that most people reserve only for those they consider worthy of their time. Most people in Michael's experience did not do such things. They isolated themselves in the cocoons of their own concerns, reading their newspapers, staring out windows, existing in proximity to others while maintaining perfect psychological distance. But Eleanor seemed constitutionally incapable of such isolation. She was speaking to the boy as though he was a human being worthy of her attention, as though his existence mattered, as though what he thought and felt and experienced had relevance to her own consciousness. For a moment, Michael felt something stir within him, an emotion so foreign that it took him several seconds to identify it. It was envy. He envied Eleanor's ability to connect, to reach across the divide between strangers and create some form of genuine human contact. He envied the boy's apparent willingness to accept this overture, to allow someone to show him kindness without cynicism or suspicion. He found himself wondering what that would feel like, to have another human being look at you with genuine interest, to ask about your life not out of social obligation but out of authentic curiosity. Then the feeling passed, and Michael would turn to his work, to the familiar rhythms of his mechanical existence. Whatever conversation was happening in the passenger car behind him was not his concern. He was here to drive the train, not to participate in the human dramas that played out among his passengers. He had learned long ago that involvement led to complication, and complication led to pain. Better to remain separate, remain untouched, remain safe. By mid-morning, the train had settled into a steady pace. The landscape had begun to change subtly, the open fields giving way to patches of forest, the terrain becoming slightly more varied and interesting. Michael's mind, which had learned to run on a kind of autopilot, drifted into the half-aware state it occupied during long stretches of familiar track. He thought, as he sometimes did, about the roads not taken. What would his life have been if he had pursued his ambitions? If he had gone to engineering school despite his mother's objections and fears? If he had been willing to take risks, to embrace uncertainty, to believe that the future could be shaped by individual effort and will? These were old thoughts, worn smooth with repetition, and they no longer carried much emotional weight. They were memories of a different man, a younger man who believed the world was something that could be changed through individual effort and determination. Michael knew better now. The world was a machine, and human beings were simply components within it. Some components worked well, some worked poorly, but in the end, they all wore out and were replaced. His role was simply to function, to move from point A to point B, to do so reliably and without complaint. That was all life asked of him, and that was all he would ask of life. It was a simple equation, a straightforward arrangement that required no emotional investment and offered no possibility of disappointment. The train continued its steady progress towards Boston, carrying within it a truck driver who had surrendered to fate, an old woman who had not, and a young man who was still deciding which path he would choose. None of them knew that their lives were about to collide in ways that would alter each of them forever. If they had known, perhaps they might have altered their choices. But fate, as it always does, works in the spaces between what we know
and what we are about to discover.
The route between New York and Boston passed through the town of New Haven just after midday. It was here that the train was scheduled to stop for 30 minutes, a break in the routine that had become as predictable as the routine itself. Michael guided the locomotive into the station with the precision of long practice, bringing the massive engine to a complete halt without jolt or sudden movement. The rhythmic hiss of escaping steam marked the pause in their journey, and for a moment the train seemed to exhale as though it too needed rest from its labor. Michael descended from the locomotive to perform his customary inspection. These stops were essential. Check the coupling mechanisms to ensure they remain secure, examine the wheels for any signs of damage or excessive wear, ensure that the boiler maintained proper pressure. Verify that all of the mechanical systems remained in proper working order. It was during these inspections that Michael actually performed something close to purposeful activity. In his inspection of the machine, he found a kind of clarity that his own life rarely afforded him. The machine had a purpose and a function. It was built for something specific and performed that function without question or complaint. If only human life could be so straightforward. He was bent beneath the locomotive, examining the undercarriage with the careful attention he always brought to such work, when he heard the commotion. At first it was distant, a disturbance that seemed to come from somewhere near the station platform. Michael's first instinct was to ignore it. Problems that did not directly concern the operation of the locomotive were not his responsibility. The station master could deal with whatever minor disruption was occurring. Michael had no obligation to involve himself in matters outside his direct purview. But then the sound grew louder, and there was something in its quality, an edge of desperation and aggression that made him pause. Raised voices, one of them clearly belonging to someone in authority, someone accustomed to being obeyed. Michael extracted himself from beneath the engine and straightened, his attention now drawn toward the station building. A man had arrived on horseback, a man whose bearing suggested both authority and fury. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and he wore the clothes of a merchant of some means, expensive fabric, well-tailored, speaking to success and status. Even from a distance, Michael could see the anger radiating from him like heat from a stove. The man dismounted from his horse with barely restrained violence, handling the reins with unnecessary roughness before handing them to a startled station attendant. He strode directly toward the train, his eyes scanning the windows with the intensity of someone searching for something of great importance. Michael felt a flutter of unease in his chest, an emotion that he had learned to suppress over the years, but which now demanded his attention. Then the man noticed Michael. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Michael understood that he was about to witness something significant. The man's expression shifted from general anger to specific focus. He had found what he was looking for. He was looking at Michael's train, or rather, he was looking for someone or something on Michael's train. The man boarded without any attempt at politeness or procedure. He simply pushed past the station attendant and stepped into the passenger car, his movements aggressive and purposeful. Michael, against his better judgment and against his ingrained habits that had trained him to avoid involvement in the affairs of passengers, found himself moving toward the car rather than away from it. Some part of him understood that whatever was about to happen, he needed to be aware of it, needed to be ready to respond if necessary. From his position at the entrance to the passenger car, Michael could see the man addressing the young passenger, the newspaper boy whose name Michael did not yet know, with a voice that carried the weight of profound authority and barely contained rage. The boy, whose name was Samuel Cooper, went absolutely still, his face draining of color in a way that suggested the appearance of the man represented something very specific and very terrifying to him. Michael watched as Samuel's hands began to shake slightly, and his eyes darted around as though looking for escape routes. Eleanor, who had been sitting calmly, reading a small book she had brought with her, looked up with the undisturbed expression of someone who had seen enough of life to know that drama, once initiated, usually resolved itself one way or another. She did not seem frightened, merely observant, as though she was watching a performance of which she was mildly curious but not particularly invested. The man, whose name Michael would later learn, was Gregory Matthews, began speaking in tones that were clearly meant to be menacing. He spoke of theft, of betrayal, of a broken arrangement that had created obligations that Samuel had failed to meet. He spoke of money that had gone missing, and of Samuel's responsibility for said missing money. The words tumbled out with the force of accumulated grievance, years of something building up and now finding expression in this very public confrontation. Spittle flew from Gregory's mouth as he spoke, and his face had become flushed with rage. Michael watched as Gregory's tone grew more aggressive and his words began to be accompanied by physical gestures, his hand reaching out toward Samuel with clear intent, his body language shifting from accusation to threat, his fingers curled into fists as he moved closer to the terrified young man. Samuel shrank back in his seat, his newspapers falling to the floor, scattering across the cabin floor like autumn leaves. His entire body language was that of an animal caught in a trap with no escape. He pressed himself against the window as though trying to merge with the glass itself, to become invisible, to disappear entirely. Eleanor rose from her seat with the slow deliberation of age, her cane tapping against the floor as she moved to position herself between Gregory and Samuel. It was a gesture that was both brave and almost comically futile. An elderly woman, perhaps 65 years old, placing her frail frame between a much larger, younger man and his perceived target. But Eleanor's face showed no fear, only a kind of resigned determination, as though she had made a decision long ago about what kind of person she would be in moments like this. "This boy has done you no harm," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a quality of absolute certainty that seemed to momentarily arrest Gregory's forward motion. The certainty in her tone was remarkable. It was not angry, not accusatory, simply stating a fact as clearly as one might state that water is wet. Whatever dispute you have with him, it will not be resolved through violence and intimidation in a public conveyance. Such behavior is beneath you, and you know it. Gregory turned his attention toward Eleanor, and I saw the calculation in his eyes shift. Here was no small boy to terrify, but an elderly woman. For a moment, Gregory seemed to consider his options, to recalculate his strategy. Then something seemed to harden in his expression, and the politeness that had briefly flickered vanished. His hand reached out and grasped Eleanor's arm, pulling her roughly away from Samuel with a force that seemed excessive. It was a small motion, but it was a motion of violence nonetheless. The indignity of it, the casual cruelty, struck Michael with unexpected force.
Something fundamental shifted within Michael Brennan in that moment. It was as though a part of him that had been dormant for 2 decades suddenly awakened. It was not a sensation he could articulate, not rational or planned. It was simply a response, as automatic and instinctive as withdrawing your hand from fire. 20 years of psychological distance, 20 years of carefully maintained detachment suddenly became unbearable. Michael moved into the passenger car and positioned himself between Gregory and both Eleanor and Samuel. His voice, when he spoke, was steady in a way that surprised him. The voice of a man who had spent 20 years speaking only when necessary, only the minimum required, suddenly found itself speaking with clarity and conviction. "You will release the lady and you will exit this train immediately." Gregory turned to look at Michael with the expression of a man who was being interrupted by something he considered beneath his notice. "This is none of your concern, driver. This boy owes me money, and I have come to collect on that debt. This is a matter of business, and business is not the concern of common laborers such as yourself. Step aside." "The train is not a place for threats and violence," Michael said, his voice somehow finding strength he did not know he possessed. "The train is not a place for threats and violence," Michael said. "You will leave now, or I will have you removed by force if necessary. I am speaking as both the operator of this train and as a man who has witnessed assault on 2 innocent people. You have exactly 10 seconds to exit this car of your own volition." For a moment, Gregory seemed to be calculating odds and consequences. Then he released Eleanor and stepped forward toward Michael, his fists clenching with clear intent to commit violence. Michael, who had never been in a fight in his adult life, who had spent 2 decades avoiding any situation that might require physical confrontation,
found himself completely uncertain about what to do. He was taller than Gregory, but Gregory had the look of a man who had engaged in violence before and had probably been victorious more often than not. Michael's physical advantage was real but unproven in actual combat. Before Gregory could make contact, Eleanor struck him across the back with her cane, not a heavy blow, but enough to be significant. The sound of wood connecting with ribs resonated through the passenger car. In my day, men behaved with civility. In my day, such behavior would result in social ostracism and potential criminal charges. What sort of man threatens a child and an old woman in front of witnesses? Have you no shame? Have you no conscience? Gregory spun toward Eleanor with his hand raised, but the moment of hesitation had given Michael time to act. Michael stepped forward and grasped Gregory's raised wrist, not violently, but with absolute firmness. His grip was firm enough that Gregory could not easily pull free. There was a moment of absolute tension, a second in which anything could happen, in which Michael's 20 years of passivity hung in the balance against something that had awakened in him. Michael's eyes met Gregory's, and he could see the calculation happening in real time. Gregory realized that he had lost control of the situation. What should have been a simple intimidation of a frightened boy had transformed into a confrontation with an entire group, including a man who was not frightened and who had demonstrated a willingness to use physical force. Gregory's authority, as it was, derived entirely from the fear he could inspire. But fear, once broken, was difficult to reestablish. Gregory withdrew his hand and stepped back, pulling his wrist free from Michael's grip. He moved toward the exit of the passenger car, his movements now those of someone in controlled retreat, rather than those of someone forced backward. "This is not finished," he said, directing his words toward Samuel with the weight of pure menace. "You have taken something that belongs to me, and you will answer for it. This train is temporary shelter, but eventually you will arrive somewhere, and when you do, you will not have this man or this old woman to protect you. Remember that." Then Gregory turned and exited the train, his departure carrying an air of menace that lingered like smoke long after he was gone. Michael realized that his heart was racing, that his hands were trembling slightly. He had done something his entire adult existence had trained him not to do. He had involved himself in a situation that was not his direct responsibility. He had taken a risk, had stepped outside the boundaries of his carefully maintained detachment. He had become a participant in the world rather than an observer of it. Eleanor resumed her seat, though Michael noticed that her hands were not entirely steady. Samuel remained completely silent, his eyes fixed on the floor as though examining it for the first time, his entire body language conveying shock and something else. Was it gratitude? Was it hope? Michael found that he did not know what to say, so he said nothing. He simply returned to his position in the locomotive, and when the station master signaled that it was time to depart, engaged the locomotive with more force than usual. As the train pulled away from New Haven, Michael became acutely aware of several things. First, he had just made a decision that could have consequences he could not yet perceive. Second, Gregory's final words contained a threat that seemed to extend beyond the moment, suggesting future encounters and future danger. Third, and perhaps most importantly, something within him had changed in a way that he did not entirely understand and could not easily undo.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The afternoon light had taken on the golden quality that spoke of approaching evening when the revelation came. Michael was still operating the locomotive, still maintaining the familiar rhythms of forward motion, when Eleanor appeared at his position. She had somehow managed to move forward through the coupling between cars, and now stood at the entrance to the locomotive cabin, holding to the frame for support against the gentle rocking of the train. Michael was startled by her appearance, not frightened, but genuinely surprised. Passengers did not typically come forward to the locomotive area. There was an informal understanding that the locomotive was the domain of the crew, that passengers remained in the passenger cars behind.
Yet here Eleanor stood, defying convention, and Michael found himself unable to simply turn her away as protocol might have suggested. "Your bravery earlier deserves explanation," Eleanor said, without preamble. She was a woman, Michael was learning, who did not traffic in unnecessary pleasantries or social conventions. She spoke with the directness of someone who had lived long enough to know that time was valuable and should not be wasted on superficial niceties. "Young Samuel has told me a story that I believe you should hear, not because you are obligated to hear it, but because your actions have positioned you in the midst of circumstances that you may not fully understand. Knowledge, Mr. Brennan, changes everything. Ignorance may be bliss, but it is also dangerous." Michael hesitated. He wanted to return to his previous state of uninvolvement, to maintain the psychological distance that had served him so well for so many years. But there was something in Eleanor's eyes, a quality of absolute directness that made refusal seem impossible, that compelled him to gesture toward a small bench positioned in the locomotive cabin. Eleanor settled herself on it with the careful movements of age, her cane positioned across her lap, and then she began to tell him Samuel's story. Samuel Cooper, Eleanor explained in her measured, deliberate way, had been living under the control of a man named Gregory Matthews for approximately 3 years. In the beginning, Matthews had presented himself as a business person and potential mentor. Matthews ran what appeared to be a legitimate business, a newspaper distribution operation that employed young men and boys to sell papers along various routes and to travelers on trains, steamships, and in public spaces. The work was presented as an opportunity, a way for ambitious young people to earn money and build toward independence. But the business was, in reality, something much darker and more exploitative. Matthews took the vast majority of the money that the boys earned, providing them with only the barest subsistence, just enough food to keep them functional, just enough shelter to sleep, nothing more. When the boys complained or attempted to leave, when they questioned the arrangement or suggested that the distribution of earnings was unfair, they were met with violence and threats. Matthews employed several large men whose sole purpose seemed to be enforcing his will through intimidation and brutality. Samuel was one of the worst treated among Matthews' employees, Eleanor explained, because of an incident that had occurred 2 months prior. Samuel, through a combination of hard work and shrewd business sense, had managed to secure a position as a primary distributor, which meant he was responsible for collecting money from the other boys and delivering it to Matthews. This was, theoretically, a position of trust and greater responsibility, though in reality it made Samuel a target. During this time, approximately $200 had gone missing, a substantial sum, the equivalent of perhaps 6 months of wages for a working man. Matthews immediately blamed Samuel, suggesting that the boy had stolen the money for his own purposes, that he was stealing from Matthews and from the other boys whose earnings were being diverted. The accusation came with threats of what would happen if the money was not returned. When Samuel protested his innocence, Matthews had beaten him severely. But here is where the story becomes complicated, Eleanor said, leaning forward slightly in her seat, her old eyes sharp with intelligence and something else. Was it anger at injustice? Was it compassion for suffering? Probably both. And here is where the truth diverges from what Matthews has told Samuel. The truth was indeed stolen, but not by Samuel. It was stolen by Matthews himself. Matthews has been embezzling from his own operation, systematically taking money and attributing the losses to careless employees or outright thievery to cover his tracks. Michael found himself caught up in the narrative, despite his best efforts to remain detached. He asked, playing the logical pragmatist, "How does this change anything?"
If Matthews was stealing from his own operation, he is still a criminal, but the crime is against his own business interests, not necessarily against Samuel directly. Such behavior is morally reprehensible, but Samuel was beaten based on a false accusation. That is the actual crime here. "You are thinking with only half the story," Eleanor said gently but firmly. Young Samuel did not simply accept the beating and return to his duties. Samuel, who is braver than many adult men I have known, decided to investigate. He suspected the truth, and he conducted a careful search of Matthews's office. Samuel found records that proved Matthews's guilt, found documentation of the embezzlement, found proof that Matthews had been systematically stealing from his own operation and blaming the boys to cover his tracks. Michael found himself caught up in the narrative despite his best efforts to remain detached. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though he already partly understood. "What possible response are you seeking? Do you want me to go to authorities? Do you want me to help Samuel escape? Do you want me to confront Matthews again? I cannot do any of those things. I cannot be what you seem to need me to be." "I want nothing from you," Eleanor said gently. "I am an old woman on a train, heading home to a quiet life. I will arrive at my destination, and you will likely never see me again. But Samuel has nowhere to go. His family has abandoned him, refusing to take him in when they learned he was causing trouble for a man as connected and influential as Gregory Matthews. His parents view Matthews as someone of status and believe Samuel's accusations against him are the lies of an ungrateful child. The relative he was seeking in Boston, a cousin he hoped would take him in, has moved away and cannot be located. The boy is essentially alone in the world, marked now as a runaway and a thief according to the story Matthews has spread throughout the city."
Eleanor moved forward, her voice becoming more passionate, more animated. "I have invited Samuel to travel with me to my home in Boston. I have a small house and a small income that comes from renting out rooms and doing needlework. I cannot provide him with great wealth or luxury, but I can provide him with shelter and the opportunity to find legitimate work. But he is frightened, Mr. Brennan, and he is struggling with the fear that Matthews will find him and take revenge, not just against Samuel, but against anyone who has aided him. What he needs now, what perhaps all of us need, is assurance that his courageous act, standing up against injustice, refusing to accept blame for crimes he did not commit, will not result in abandonment by the world at large." "What are you saying?" Michael asked, though part of him already understood the direction this conversation was heading, understood the implications of Eleanor's words. "I am saying that your actions have consequences, whether you intended them or not. Gregory Matthews is a dangerous man, and he will likely seek some form of retribution against anyone who has thwarted him, anyone who has prevented him from reclaiming his property, for that is how he views Samuel, as property, as an investment that needs to be recovered. Samuel needs to know that the world still contains people who are willing to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. He needs models of behavior, examples of courage that contradict everything he has learned from his years under Matthew's control." Eleanor rose slowly from the bench, supporting herself against the locomotive frame with movements that revealed both her strength and her fragility. "I must return to the passenger car to check on Samuel. The boy is traumatized and he needs reassurance. But think about what I have told you, Mr. Brennan. Think about the choice you made today, and think about what it means for you to continue with your life exactly as you have been living it. Some moments change us. Some choices redefine who we are. This may be one of those moments for you." Eleanor made her way back toward the passenger car with careful steps, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and the rails that stretched ahead into an increasingly uncertain future. Michael spent the remainder of the journey until their stop at the terminal in Boston in a state of internal turmoil. His carefully maintained routines, his carefully constructed emotional distances, all seemed to be crumbling around him. He had done what he believed to be right, and he was rewarded with the knowledge that this right action might have consequences he had not anticipated.
His intervention had potentially made an enemy of a dangerous man. His courage had created vulnerability not just for himself, but potentially for Eleanor and Samuel as well. He had opened a door that could not easily be closed, had stepped across a line that could not easily be uncrossed. When they pulled into Boston Station, as the sun was beginning to descend toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Michael found himself performing his customary tasks almost automatically. Yet his mind was consumed with the implications of Eleanor's story. He had spent 20 years maintaining psychological distance precisely to avoid situations like this, situations in which his actions could have ramifications, in which other people's fates became connected to his own choices. As the passengers prepared to disembark, Samuel approached Michael with an awkwardness that was painful to witness. The boy's eyes contained a mixture of gratitude and fear, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Thank you," Samuel said simply, the words seeming to come from somewhere deep within, from a place where hope and terror coexisted. "Eleanor told me that you risked much by intervening. I am sorry to have brought danger into your life. I never wanted to implicate anyone else in my troubles. I should have simply accepted what Matthews told me to accept, should have simply endured." Michael looked at this young man, so young, so damaged by the world already, and yet still capable of gratitude to someone who had helped him, and he felt the barriers he had spent so long constructing beginning to crack. The walls he had built to protect himself from pain and complication were developing visible fissures. "Where will you go?" Michael asked, genuinely unsure what answer would satisfy him. "Eleanor has invited me to her home. She says she has work that needs doing, and that she will pay me fairly for it. It is more than I deserve, more than I expected. She is kind in a way that seems almost unreal, as though she is from a different world entirely. Matthews will not accept that I have escaped. He will search for me. He cannot afford to have people know that he is not all-powerful, that a boy can flee and find protection elsewhere. When he finds me, and he will find me, he will make me pay for this humiliation." "If he finds you," Eleanor interrupted, appearing beside Samuel with her traveling bags held carefully in her hands, her movements slow but determined, "he will find that you have people who care about your welfare. He will find that attacking you would create far more complications than it would solve. The world may not always be kind, but kindness does exist in it. Do not think of yourself as alone anymore. You have allies now, however humble those allies may be." Eleanor turned to Michael, and her eyes held the weight of years and the clarity of someone who had learned something essential about the nature of human connection. "What you did today, Mr. Brennan, was the first truly brave thing many people have ever witnessed. It will ripple outward in ways you cannot yet understand. But I wanted you to know that it mattered. What you did mattered more than you can possibly comprehend." Then Eleanor and Samuel departed the train, making their way through the station with the careful movements of age and the uncertain movements of youth combined. Michael watched them go, feeling a sensation that was entirely foreign to him, the sense of having crossed some threshold from which there was no return.
Michael returned to the rail yard for his next scheduled departure, which was to begin the return journey from Boston to New York the following morning. He expected to simply resume his familiar routine, to settle back into the comfortable numbness that had sustained him for 2 decades. But something fundamental had shifted, and he found himself unable to access that state of psychological distance that had always been available to him before. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his small apartment above the bookstore, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, and found his mind replaying the events of the previous day with obsessive clarity. He thought about Gregory Matthews, about the casual cruelty with which the man had threatened violence against those who opposed him. He thought about Samuel's fear and Eleanor's courage. He thought about his own actions and the fact that he had done something genuinely significant after 20 years of careful insignificance. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled by dreams, dark, fractured images of pursuit and danger,
visions of consequences playing out across landscapes that were simultaneously familiar and strange. Michael woke in the early hours before dawn, his heart racing, and found himself unable to return to sleep. He rose and dressed in the darkness, spending the remaining hours before dawn sitting in a chair by his window, watching the city slowly transform from black silhouette to grayscale to full color. When he arrived at the rail yard, the station master seemed unchanged, the same bureaucratic efficiency, the same indifference to the individual components of the machine he managed. Michael went through his pre-journey inspections with the same mechanical precision he had always employed. Yet he found himself performing these tasks with a new awareness, a consciousness of the fact that machines, unlike humans, did not change their fundamental nature or their fundamental purpose. The passengers for the return journey were different from those who had traveled the previous day, though equally ordinary in their appearance. Businessmen with portfolios containing the details of commercial enterprises, women traveling to visit family members they had not seen in months, merchants conducting their commercial ventures from train to train. None of them knew about the events that had transpired the day before. None of them knew that they were boarding a train that had been the site of moral transformation, that had carried within it people who had faced crucial decisions about right and wrong. Michael was just beginning to feel as though he might be able to settle back into routine when Gregory Matthews boarded the train at the first station outside of Boston, a smaller station called Attleboro. The man was alone, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was not primarily a traveler, but rather someone with a specific and urgent purpose. He moved through the station with the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Gregory scanned the passenger car with the intensity of someone searching for something in particular. Then his eyes found Michael, standing in his position near the locomotive connection, and Gregory's expression shifted to a smile that contained nothing of warmth or friendliness. It was the smile of a predator that has located its prey. Gregory approached Michael with a casualness that was somehow more menacing than any aggressive posture could have been. His movements were relaxed, his expression controlled, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested depths of cruelty that had not been visible the day before. "Mr. Brennan, I believe it is," Gregory said, his voice smooth and cultivated, the voice of an educated man, despite his crude actions. "I have learned that you are the driver of this locomotive. I have also learned, through various inquiries, that yesterday you saw fit to interfere in my business affairs. I have come to explain to you why that interference was a serious and potentially catastrophic mistake." Michael's initial response was to deny, to attempt to establish a narrative in which he had done nothing remarkable, nothing worthy of Gregory's attention. But then he looked into Gregory's eyes and saw the calculation there, the careful assessment of an opponent, the cold analysis of someone determining what approach would be most effective. Michael realized that any attempt to minimize his actions would only reveal weakness, would only demonstrate that Michael was uncertain about what he had done. "What I did yesterday," Michael said carefully, his voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to coalesce in his chest, "was prevent a crime. The boy has done nothing wrong. You have no legitimate claim over him. What you did to him constitutes assault, regardless of what justification you attempt to provide." Gregory's smile widened, and he actually laughed, a sound without genuine humor, a sound meant to demonstrate that he found Michael's moral position amusing and somewhat quaint. "Ah, you see, here is where your thinking is fundamentally flawed. You are operating under the assumption that legitimacy comes from morality, from what is right in some abstract sense. You are operating under the assumption that justice exists in this world, that the universe contains some form of inherent fairness. But the world is not built on such abstractions. The world is built on power and on the willingness to exercise that power without hesitation or self-doubt. Your intervention yesterday was built on the assumption that moral truth has weight in the real world. It does not.
Moral truth is an ornament, a decoration that makes people feel better about the essentially brutal nature of existence. You beat a boy for a crime he did not commit. I was there. I know what I saw. I know what occurred. Did you? Gregory asked, stepping closer to Michael, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that was more threatening than his raised voice had been. Or did you see a man attempting to discipline an employee who had violated his trust? You saw what you wanted to see, viewed through the lens of your own sentimental beliefs about the nature of justice and fair treatment. You saw what your emotions wanted you to see, rather than what was actually occurring. But that is not relevant, because what is relevant is this. You have inserted yourself into my business affairs, and there are always consequences to such insertion. Michael felt a coldness at the base of his spine, the first stirring of genuine fear. He had not anticipated that Gregory would pursue this confrontation, had not considered what such pursuit might entail. "Are you threatening me?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not threatening," Gregory said, with the sort of smile that typically precedes extensive harm or psychological torment. "Simply explaining cause and effect. You have cost me the services of an employee who was moderately useful to my operations. You have also embarrassed me, in the sense that word has begun to circulate throughout the business community that I was defied by a common train driver and that I did nothing in return. This is a problem for me. It suggests weakness. It suggests that my authority can be challenged with impunity. This cannot stand." Gregory turned to leave, moving toward the exit of the locomotive chamber, then paused and looked back at Michael. His voice, when he spoke, was carefully modulated to be perfectly polite, perfectly reasonable, which made the threat contained within his words even chilling. "I own a great many things in this city, Mr. Brennan. I own warehouses and businesses, and I own people, or rather I employ people who have learned to understand the value of cooperation and compliance. What I am going to suggest to you is that you accept the situation as it stands. Accept that the boy was mine to do with as I wished, and that your interference, while temporarily effective, has no ability to alter the fundamental reality of that relationship." "And if I don't accept that?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper, uncertain whether he truly wanted to hear the answer. "Then you will find that the world becomes a considerably more complicated place for you. I could spread word among all the railroad companies that you were negligent in your duties, that you abandoned your position to engage in unauthorized activities. I could make certain that you never work for any railroad again, making you essentially unemployable in the profession that has defined your entire adult life. I could see to it that your small apartment becomes available through various legal maneuvers and complications. I could arrange for your meager savings to be seized for debts, both real and fabricated. I have the resources and the connections to make your life essentially impossible, to reduce you to homelessness and destitution. What I am offering you is the opportunity to avoid that outcome. What I am offering you is the chance to simply forget about the boy and to continue with your life as it was before this unfortunate incident occurred."
Then Gregory departed the train as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving Michael standing alone in the locomotive chamber, his entire understanding of the situation fundamentally altered. Gregory's words had made clear something that Michael had intellectually understood, but had not truly internalized. There were real, material consequences to his actions. By intervening on Samuel's behalf, he had made an enemy of a man with significant power and resources. More importantly, he had done so in a way that could not be undone. He could not simply decide to retreat back into his psychological distance and expect that Gregory would forget about his intervention.
For the remainder of the journey back to New York, Michael's mind raced through various scenarios and potential outcomes. Gregory's threats were not idle. Michael knew enough about the world to understand that a man in Gregory's position could make good on his threats. The railroad industry was not large. A blacklist could effectively end Michael's career. The loss of his job would lead to the loss of his apartment. The loss of his apartment would lead to destitution. Yet alongside this terror, Michael began to experience something else. Something that was more difficult to articulate, but which felt almost like relief. For 20 years, he had lived in fear of losing what little he had. That fear had driven his entire existence, had shaped every decision, had created the psychological distance that had become his defining characteristic. Now that the worst-case scenario was beginning to materialize, now that he was actually facing the possibility of losing his job and his livelihood, Michael began to understand that perhaps this fear was not as powerful as he had believed it to be. When the train pulled into New York Station, Michael made a decision. He would visit Eleanor's address in Boston. He would return to that small house on the outskirts of the city and ensure that Eleanor understood the full extent of Gregory's threat. And then, perhaps with Eleanor's wisdom and experience, they could determine a course of action that did not simply involve lying down and accepting the destruction of one's life. He submitted a request for a leave of absence, claiming that he needed to attend to personal matters. The station master, who had never known Michael to request time away from his duties, seemed surprised, but approved the request. 3 days later, Michael boarded a train heading north toward Boston, but this time he was a passenger rather than the operator. This time, he was moving through the world rather than simply facilitating movement for others.
Eleanor's house was exactly as Michael remembered it from Eleanor's description of it. A modest Victorian structure painted in faded blue, with a small garden that showed signs of seasonal decline. But when Michael arrived, he found something unexpected. Samuel was not alone with Eleanor. Instead, there was a man in a dark suit sitting in the parlor, drinking tea, his demeanor one of official business and serious purpose. "Mr. Brennan," Eleanor said, rising to greet him, "this is Federal Agent Robert Hayes. He has been investigating Gregory Matthews for several years. There have been developments that you should be aware of." Michael's heart began to race. Had something happened to Samuel? Had Matthews discovered Eleanor's address and done something terrible? But Samuel emerged from the kitchen, alive and unharmed, carrying a tray with bread and cheese. The boy looked better than he had on the train. His color had improved. His eyes held more life, though the fear was still present beneath the surface. Agent Hayes rose and extended his hand. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you were present during the incident on the train 2 days ago. I understand you intervened when Gregory Matthews attempted to retrieve an employee who had fled his operation. Is that correct?" Michael shook the agent's hand, confused by this turn of events. "Yes, but I don't understand." "You need to understand something about Gregory Matthews," Hayes said, gesturing for Michael to sit. "Matthews is not simply an exploitative businessman. He is part of a criminal enterprise that extends far beyond Boston. He is involved in human trafficking, forced labor, exploitation of minors, and systematic fraud. We have been investigating him for 4 years, but we have lacked the testimony of someone who has actually experienced his operation from the inside." Hayes turned to Samuel. "Young Samuel here has agreed to provide testimony regarding his experiences under Matthew's control. More importantly, Samuel has provided us with information that has allowed us to identify other victims and other locations where similar exploitation is occurring." Michael's heart began to race. Had something happened to Samuel? Had Matthews discovered Eleanor's address and done something terrible? But Samuel emerged from the kitchen, alive and unharmed, carrying a tray with bread and cheese. The boy looked better than he had on the train. His color had improved, his eyes held more life, though the fear was still present beneath the surface. Agent Hayes rose and extended his hand. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you were present during the incident on the train 2 days ago.
I understand you intervened when Gregory Matthews attempted to retrieve an employee who had fled his operation. Is that correct? Michael shook the agent's hand, confused by this turn of events. Yes, but I don't understand. You need to understand something about Gregory Matthews, Hayes said, gesturing for Michael to sit. Matthews is not simply an exploitative businessman. He is part of a criminal enterprise that extends far beyond Boston. He is involved in human trafficking, forced labor, exploitation of minors, and systematic fraud. We have been investigating him for 4 years, but we have lacked the testimony of someone who has actually experienced his operation from the inside. Hayes turned to Samuel. Young Samuel here has agreed to provide testimony regarding his experiences under Matthew's control. More importantly, Samuel has provided us with information that has allowed us to identify other victims and other locations where similar exploitation is occurring. Michael felt something shift within him, a sense that perhaps he had not made a terrible mistake, that perhaps his intervention had been part of something larger than he could have anticipated. What does this mean? He asked. It means, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of satisfaction, that your courage was not in vain. It means that by standing up for Samuel, you have helped to bring down a criminal enterprise that has been destroying young people's lives for years. Agent Hayes continued. We are preparing to file charges against Matthews. With Samuel's testimony and with your testimony regarding the incident on the train 2 days ago, we have sufficient evidence to pursue prosecution. However, this also means that both you and Samuel will need to testify in court, which means that Matthews will become aware of your involvement if he is not already. Michael felt the weight of this realization. Gregory had threatened me because Gregory knew that I had the potential to become a witness. Now that potential was becoming a reality. Matthews threatened to destroy me. He said he would make it impossible for me to find employment, that he would see to my destruction. Yes, Hayes said, that is a crime in itself, threatening a witness. That is something we can add to the charges against Matthews. But more importantly, once Matthews is arrested and imprisoned, his ability to carry out those threats becomes severely limited. When will he be arrested? We are preparing the paperwork now. We should have enough to move forward within a week. However, we wanted to speak with you first to ensure that you understood what you were committing to by providing testimony. Michael sat back in the chair, his mind processing this information. The situation had transformed entirely. What had begun a simple act of intervention had become part of something far larger, far more significant. His act of courage had not resulted in his own destruction, but instead had positioned him as part of ending a criminal enterprise. I will testify, Michael said without hesitation. I will provide whatever testimony is necessary. Over the following week, Michael worked with Agent Hayes to prepare his testimony. He provided detailed accounts of the incident on the train, of Gregory's subsequent threats, of his understanding of the situation. Samuel provided his own testimony that was far more damaging to Matthews than anything Michael could provide, because Samuel had lived within Matthews' system and could speak to its day-to-day brutality. When federal marshals arrested Gregory Matthews, he was taken into custody on multiple charges: human trafficking, forced labor, fraud, and threatening a witness. The evidence against him was substantial and compelling. The trial, which took place 3 months later, lasted 2 weeks. Michael gave his testimony calmly and clearly. Samuel gave his testimony with the courage of youth who had finally found support and protection. Other witnesses came forward, other boys who had worked under Matthews, other people who had witnessed his crimes. The testimony painted a picture of systematic brutality and exploitation. The verdict came back guilty on all counts.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.